Welcome to part 4 of a brief history of Ukraine. Originally this was going to be the final part of the series, but the file got corrupted, so here we are. Strap in and make yourself comfortable. This took a long time to make and edit, so I'd greatly appreciate if you could like, comment, subscribe and all that jazz. It's part 3 if you missed it. Go get yourself a cup of tea and let's get right in. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union, and Ukraine by extension, was a drastically different place from the Stalinist era. No longer was it acceptable for freedom of speech to be curtailed by the state, nor personal liberties constrained. The Soviets had entered a prolonged period of economic stagnation, and had by all accounts lost both the arms race and the space race with the West. If the Union was to even stay intact, some major reforms would be needed, and boy did Gorbachev get to those reforms. His two primary reforms were known as perestroika, meaning restructuring of the USSR's political institutions, as well as glasnost, meaning openness and the lifting of restrictions against criticism of the state. Gorbachev was under the assumption that these liberalizing reforms would reinvigorate loyalty to communism, but he was sorely mistaken. The people of the Union had been promised a socialist utopia for decades, but were instead met with a declining standard of living and a stagnant economy. To put it bluntly, people were sick of communism on all fronts, and Gorbachev's reforms only enabled the propagation of this opposition. The previous dominance of Ukrainian politicians in the Union had become a thing of the past, since Gorbachev had no reliance on them when it came to maintaining his power. Nationalism, naively thought to have been purged, reappeared in the constituent republics, from the Baltics through to the Caucasus, with Ukraine amongst the most restless. A growing power imbalance had become apparent, as many started to resent the increasingly centralized control that Moscow exerted. For example, native people had previously been appointed to head of party in many SSRs, but Gorbachev rescinded this by appointing an ethnic Russian as head of the Kazakhstan's Communist Party. Various movements across the Union began to spring up under the veil of perestroika. A movement known as the Cossacophiles had gained prominence in recent years, romanticizing Ukraine's Cossack past and using that as a new basis for modern Ukrainian identity. Moscow initially saw this as a threat, but changed tack and promoted it, framing Cossack society as one that had embodied nascent socialist values. However, this tactic had the opposite effect and bolstered nationalism, with many in Ukraine beginning to question why they even needed to follow Moscow. The Chernobyl incident of 1986 only reinforced this sentiment, when the nuclear reactor near the city of Chernobyl failed and blew up, irradiating a large portion of southern Belarus and northern Ukraine, including Kyiv. The lack of autonomy and forced reliance on Moscow to deal with the crisis outraged many Ukrainian officials, even those previously loyal to the Moscow regime. Many Ukrainian students suffered radiation poisoning after being sent out to clear up waste with minimal protection, whilst a military parade in Kyiv was forced to go ahead despite risk of contamination. The USSR risked internal dissatisfaction to maintain a front of stability to the outside world. Even before Gorbachev's ascent to power, Ukrainian dissident groups had been formed from intellectuals that had been released from gulags, such as the Ukrainian Helsinki Group in the 70s, with the group reforming in 1988 to become the Ukrainian Helsinki Union. The Helsinki Group was the first openly political organization not controlled by the state under perestroika, and had been formed to monitor human rights within Ukraine. Many more quickly sprang up. The Society of the Ukrainian Language was formed in 1989 to protect and re-energize the Ukrainian language, whilst many historical figures such as Mikhailo Hrushevsky and Bohdan Khmelnytsky were rehabilitated. The East Catholic Church was legalized once again, and political organizations began to take hold in local communist elections. The USSR was now in considerable danger. The Baltic states, led by Lithuania in 1990, were the first to declare outright independence from the USSR, whilst Ukraine declared itself a sovereign country, though this didn't necessarily mean it would secede from the USSR completely. Trying to appease everyone, Gorbachev had pleased no one with his reforms. The economy was in freefall, and living standards crashed even further. The era of stagnation during Brezhnev's rule seemed like a utopia in comparison. The various countries within the Eastern Bloc began to hastily break away from Moscow's control. Poland's solidarity movement, led by trade unions, is probably the most famous example of the independence movements within the Eastern Bloc. Before too long, the USSR's sphere of influence had collapsed entirely. The USSR itself would soon walk down the same path of oblivion. Now concerned, Gorbachev rolled back various democratic freedoms to try and coerce the Union together but once again it had the opposite effect. Ukrainian students began a hunger strike in Kyiv in 1990, and before too long, armed clashes between police and protesters took place. Leonid Kravchuk, the chairman of the Ukrainian Communist Party, acceded to protesters' demands. This was the first time that grassroots political movements had succeeded in the Union, and would soon become referred to as the first Maidan protest, after the Maidan Square in Kyiv. However, Ukraine's political elites were divided between declaring outright secession or remaining within the USSR, even as Gorbachev attempted to reform it completely. In 1991, a referendum returned 70% support for a new reformed union, involving Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and a few other SSRs. Ukraine, though, wouldn't fall into what they perceived to be a trap. Interestingly, the US president at the time, George W. Bush, expressed support for the USSR to reform, as it was a valuable trading partner, which surprised many pro-independence factions within Ukraine, but even this would not stop the inevitable. On 19th of August 1991, avid communists attempted a military coup d'etat against Gorbachev, which later failed and alienated what little support was left in many Soviet states. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, declared independence from the USSR, as did Ukraine with an overwhelming majority. The USSR would later just consist of Kazakhstan for 4 days, before it was consigned to the dustbin of history. In December 1991, Ukraine held its first presidential elections, with Leonid Kravchuk winning. Regional elections were held for independence, with many in the west and centre strongly for, whilst even the south and east were more pro-independence than not. Gorbachev resigned, and the union would come to an end, not with a bang but with a whimper, bringing an end to a 74-year experiment of state communism. With independence now finally secured, Ukraine was presented with the challenge of integrating itself into the geopolitical landscape and deciding its own course for the future. In one final attempt to save the legacy of the USSR, Yeltsin aimed to create a loose union with former Soviet countries known as the Independent Commonwealth of States. Ukraine initially cooperated before pulling out of all negotiations in 1993 bar economic ones. It was a major concern within the West that the dissolution of the USSR would lead to several armed border conflicts and general instability in the region. Ukraine itself was in an unusual position. It had inherited one of the largest militaries in the world, consisting of over 6,000 tanks and 780,000 soldiers. Additionally, it had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Conversely, Ukraine's economy was down the toilet, and it lacked the political willpower or means to make proper use of these weapons. In 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum with Russia, the US, and the UK, willingly giving up their whole nuclear arsenal in exchange for some security assurances, thus becoming the first country in the world to completely embrace unilateral nuclear disarmament. Other issues remained though, namely possible border disputes and the partitioning of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, which by now was massive, comprising over 500 ships. Ukraine ended up getting about 20% of the fleet and allowed the Russian Navy to station itself within Sevastopol and Crimea. An agreement concerning territorial integrity would be followed soon after. On the international stage, Ukraine examined its aspirations and had long since decided to align itself with Europe and the West, including membership in the European Union and NATO. Russia was somewhat apprehensive about this, but wasn't really in a position to do anything about it. A few agreements urging closer cooperation between Ukraine and the various Western institutions were quickly ratified, and it seemed Ukraine was on track to become a full-fledged member of the international community. By the end of the 20th century, Ukraine had confirmed its foreign policy goals and had drawn itself closer to the EU, beginning the long road to European integration, a process still ongoing to this day. Turmoil still lay on the horizon, however. Far from prosperity, Ukraine was still rife with internal issues, including corruption, bureaucratic incompetence, and the ever-present question of whether Ukrainian democracy would even survive. Independence had been secured, but nobody knew what the future held. So that was part 4, I hope you enjoyed. Once again, don't forget to like and subscribe, as it means a lot if people enjoy these sorts of videos. I'll see you in the finale.